There's something deeply unsettling about episode 4 of the Testaments, and it's not because of one single moment, but because of what it finally reveals underneath everything we thought we understood about Gilead. Because for the first time, the show stops feeling like it's simply showing a strict society and starts revealing something much more disturbing. A system that doesn't just control people, but protects the people who do harm. And at the center of that realization are two girls who experience it in completely different ways: Agnes and Daisy. What happens to them in this episode doesn't just move the story forward, it changes the way they see everything. And once that shift happens, there's no going back. Agnes has lived her entire life inside Gilead, not outside it, not remembering a different world, inside it, which means her understanding of reality has been built entirely from what Gilead allowed her to know. And that's the first important thing to understand about her. She doesn't question Gilead because she doesn't have a reference point for anything else. She has been taught that obedience is safety, that authority is protection, that discomfort is normal, and that the world outside Gilead is either dangerous or sinful. So when she moves through life, she isn't thinking in terms of freedom or oppression. She's thinking in terms of rules, expectations, and approval. That's why Agnes is so vulnerable in ways she doesn't even recognize. Because when a system controls not just your actions, but your understanding of what actions even mean, it becomes almost impossible to identify harm when it happens. And that is exactly what makes episode 4 so disturbing. Because Dr. Grove is not introduced as a villain in the traditional sense. He doesn't look like one. He doesn't behave like one in obvious ways. He exists as something far more dangerous inside Gilead's structure. A respected professional, a trusted adult, a man protected by status. And in systems like Gilead, that status matters more than truth. Even in earlier episodes, the warning signs are subtle but present. Moments that feel uncomfortable but are easy to dismiss if you're not paying attention. Small violations of boundaries that don't immediately escalate but plant something uncomfortable in Agnes's mind. And that's how people like Grove operate. Not through immediate violence, but through gradual erosion of boundaries. Because in a society like Gilead, no one is taught to challenge authority, especially not girls like Agnes. So when she returns to his office in episode 4, there is already a sense of unease building inside her. Not fully formed, not clearly understood, but present. And that's something the show captures very realistically. Trauma doesn't always start with clarity. Sometimes it starts with discomfort you can't explain. A feeling that something is wrong, even when everything looks normal on the surface. The office looks clean, the doctor is polite, the system looks stable. But Agnes feels fear anyway, and that instinct is the only warning she has, because Gilead never gave her language to explain it. She doesn't have the vocabulary for consent. She doesn't have the framework for violation. She only has instinct. And instinct is not enough protection in a world like this. When she is sedated, the show makes a deliberate creative choice. It doesn't show explicit action. It doesn't rely on shock. Instead, it focuses on what comes after. Because the real horror is not the act itself, it is the realization. Later that night, Agnes notices something is wrong, a detail that feels small at first. Her clothing is not the way she remembers it. Something has been altered, something she didn't do. And in that moment, everything inside her begins to collapse, not loudly, not dramatically, but internally, because she starts to understand something without fully understanding it. That something happened to her while she was unconscious, that she had no control over it, that someone she was taught to trust may have violated her. And that realization is more powerful than anything visual the show could have shown, because it marks the beginning of a psychological break, not from sanity, but from belief. Up until this point, Agnes has operated under the assumption that adults in her world are fundamentally responsible. That authority figures exist to guide her, that institutions are structured for order and protection. But this moment destroys that assumption completely. Because if Dr. Grove can do something like this, then the entire structure around him becomes questionable. And that is the true horror of episode 4. It doesn't just show one act of abuse. It shows how fragile belief systems are when they are built on control rather than truth. This is also where the Testaments starts to feel very different from the Handmaid's Tale. In The Handmaid's Tale, the violence was direct, it was visible, it was systematized. People knew what was happening even if they couldn't stop it. But here, the violence is hidden. It exists behind professionalism, behind reputation, behind institutions that appear legitimate. And that makes it harder to detect and harder to confront. Because when abuse is hidden inside respectability, it doesn't look like abuse until it's too late. That is what Agnes is facing now. And she doesn't have the tools to process it, which is why her reaction is so internalized. She doesn't scream, she doesn't accuse, she doesn't even fully articulate what she feels. Instead, she shuts down because her mind is trying to reconcile two conflicting realities: the world she was taught to trust and the experience she just lived through, and those two things cannot coexist. There is also the question of Paula, a question the show deliberately refuses to answer clearly. Did she know? Did she suspect? Did she send Agnes anyway? Or is she simply another product of Gilead's conditioning? The ambiguity is intentional because Gilead doesn't only create perpetrators, it creates people who normalize harm in order to survive within the system, people who look away, people who rationalize, people who protect the system because questioning it feels too dangerous. And if Paula did know, then Agnes's situation becomes even more tragic because it means she wasn't just exposed to one predator. She was placed in his path by someone within her own household structure, which turns this from an isolated violation into something systemic. Meanwhile, Daisy's experience runs parallel, but different. At first, Daisy approaches Gilead like an outsider. She observes it. She questions it. She tries to emotionally distance herself from it, as if understanding it from a distance will protect her from it. But episode 4 removes that illusion completely, because Daisy begins to realize there is no distance in Gilead. Everything is connected, everything is controlled, everything has consequences. Even observation itself is dangerous. And that realization hits her in a different way than Agnes. While Agnes experiences internal collapse, Daisy experiences external awakening. She begins to understand that this is not a system you can navigate casually. It is not something you can watch from the sidelines. It is something that absorbs you. And that shift changes her emotionally. You can see it in her reactions, the shock, the discomfort, the slow realization that she is not outside this story. She is inside it. And that changes everything about how she will behave moving forward. What makes episode 4 so powerful is that it forces both girls toward the same truth from different directions. Agnes loses trust in authority. Daisy loses trust in distance. And once both of those illusions are gone, there is nothing left to shield them from reality. That is where transformation begins. Not in action, but in understanding. Because authoritarian systems don't collapse when people are comfortable. They collapse when belief breaks. And that is exactly what is happening here. Agnes is beginning to question whether the world she was raised in is safe at all. Daisy is beginning to understand that survival requires more than awareness. It requires action. And together, whether they realize it or not, they are being pushed toward a point where they will no longer be able to remain passive. In the broader context of the source material, Dr. Grove represents something even darker than what is shown here. His role is not isolated. It is part of a pattern that exists within Gilead's structure, where authority shields abuse and silence protects reputation. And when that pattern eventually breaks, it doesn't break quietly, it breaks publicly, which suggests that everything building here is heading toward exposure, toward confrontation, toward collapse of illusion. And that is why episode 4 matters so much, because it is not just showing harm. It is showing the moment when harm becomes undeniable, when silence stops working, when belief stops holding, when characters stop being able to ignore what they know. Agnes sees enough to never fully trust again in the same way. Daisy sees enough to never stay passive again. And that is how revolutions begin in stories like this. Not with explosions, but with realization. And once that realization takes hold, nothing remains the same.